On the Soviet monument at Babyn Yar, the inscription spoke of citizens of Kyiv and prisoners of war shot by the German fascist invaders. The words were heavy, proper in tone, official, carved in stone. But among those words, one was missing. Jews. Sometimes history is silent, not because it knows nothing. Sometimes it is silent because it was forbidden to name the victims. At Babyn Yar, people were not killed simply as residents of the city, not simply as peaceful civilians, not simply as random people who happened to be under occupation. On the 29th and 30th of September 1941, those led there were, above all, the Jews of Kyiv. Elderly people, women, children, the sick, families who had not managed to leave, could not evacuate, or believed the notice saying they were being resettled. They were killed as Jews. And then, for decades, they were too often offered memory only as Soviet citizens. This is not where a dispute over words begins. This is where a dispute begins over the victim's right to their own name. 2 seconds. If this topic feels important to you, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here, Jewish history is spoken about not for the sake of sensation, but for the sake of memory, dignity, and the truth that official formulas tried to silence for far too long. Babyn Yar is not only a place of murder. It is a place where, after people's deaths, another struggle began. A struggle over what they would be called. A struggle over one word that disappeared from public memory for far too long. Before the war, Kyiv was a city with a large Jewish life. Not abstract, not museum-like, not historical in the cold sense. Living. There were Jewish families in the city, doctors, craftsmen, engineers, teachers, tailors, musicians, students. There were kitchens where people spoke more quietly than they did in the street. There were old photographs, letters, children's coats, textbooks, prayer books, Soviet passports, and family surnames that did not yet know they would soon become a death sentence. Before the German invasion, around 160,000 Jews lived in Kyiv. That was about 1/5 of the city's population. After the war began, some people managed to leave. Some were evacuated, some served in the Red Army. But by the time of the German occupation, tens of thousands of Jews remained in the city, mostly those for whom escape was hardest. Women, children, the elderly, the sick, people without connections, without strength, without the possibility of packing an entire life into one suitcase. On the 19th of September 1941, German troops entered Kyiv. The city came under Nazi occupation. From the first days, Jews faced humiliation, violence, fear, and orders behind which the ideology of extermination already stood. Then explosions thundered in the center of Kyiv. Buildings on Khreshchatyk and nearby, where German institutions had been located, were destroyed. Historians point out that the explosions were connected to mines left behind by retreating Soviet structures. But the Nazi authorities used this as a convenient pretext. Propaganda could do what it knew how to do coldly and quickly: appoint the Jews as guilty. This was not mob chaos. This was a mechanism. First, an image of the enemy is created. Then comes the order. Then the person disappears. On the 28th of September, notices were posted across Kyiv. The Jews of the city were ordered to appear the next morning at the assembly point near Dorohozhitska Street and the Jewish cemetery. They were told to bring documents, money, valuables, and warm clothing. Failure to appear was punishable by death. It sounded like resettlement, like evacuation, like a terrifying but still understandable order from an occupying authority. Many believed exactly that, not because they were naive, but because the human mind searches until the very end for an explanation in which life continues. If they tell you to bring documents, then they must be checking them. If they tell you to bring belongings, then they must be taking you somewhere. If there is a railway nearby, then perhaps it is deportation, labor, a camp, the unknown, but not immediate death. A person often believes in tomorrow, even when the killers have already decided there will be no tomorrow for him. On the morning of September 29th, Jewish families walked through the city. This was not a military column. This was a city carrying itself toward the edge. People walked with bundles, bags, children in their arms, elderly relatives beside them. Someone carried documents, someone carried family valuables, someone carried bread. Someone, perhaps, was thinking only about not losing their child in the crowd. And here, it is important to stop. These people must not be turned into a number immediately. The number must be remembered, but a number without a face becomes convenient for indifference. 33,771 people. That is the figure given in the Einsatzgruppen report for the number of Jews killed at Babyn Yar over 2 days. But before that figure, there were names. Manya, Yosef, Clara, Dina, Reuven, Sarah, an old man who could barely hear the order, a boy holding onto his mother's sleeve, a woman who may have brought her best dress because she did not know where she was being taken, a family that in the morning was still a family, and by evening had become a line in the killer's report. At Babyn Yar, units of the German police, SS men, and the Sonderkommando under Paul Blobel, part of Einsatzgruppe C, operated. They were assisted by units of auxiliary police, as well as individual local collaborators. This must be said precisely. Responsibility lay with the Nazi occupation machine and with the specific people who participated in its crimes. This must not be turned into an accusation against entire peoples. History demands precision. Where structures, orders, and perpetrators are guilty, they must not be replaced with ethnic hatred. People were brought to the ravine. Their belongings were taken. They were separated, driven further. The shooting itself cannot be spoken of lightly. It cannot be spoken of beautifully. There is no beauty there. There is only a crime. People were forced to descend into the ravine, in groups, under weapons, under shouting, under orders. Then they were shot, briefly, coldly, methodically. 2 days, September 29th, September 30th. 33,771 murdered Jews. Threes. It was one of the largest mass killings of Jews in a single place during the Second World War. Sometimes the Holocaust is imagined through camps, trains, gas chambers, barbed wire. But on the territory of the occupied Soviet Union, a significant part of the extermination happened differently. Historians often call this the Holocaust by bullets. Ravines, forests, city outskirts, ditches, anti-tank trenches. People were killed near their homes, near roads, near the places where ordinary life had still existed the day before. Babyn Yar became one of the most terrible symbols of that extermination. But Babyn Yar did not end on September 30th. In the following months and years of German occupation, this place remained a killing zone. Not only Jews were shot there. Roma were killed there, Soviet prisoners of war, underground resistance members, patients of a psychiatric hospital, civilians, Ukrainian nationalists, people of different fates and different identities who became victims of Nazi terror. This must also be remembered. But remembering other victims does not mean erasing the Jewish core of the tragedy of September 29th and 30th. Memory should not work as substitution. It should work as precision. It is possible and necessary to say, Babyn Yar was a place where different groups of people were murdered. And at the same time, it is necessary to say, in the first 2 days of the mass shooting, it was above all the Jews of Kyiv who were exterminated there, and precisely as Jews. That was the word that later became difficult. After the liberation of Kyiv in November 1943, Soviet authorities had the opportunity to investigate the occupiers' crimes. There were witnesses, there were traces, there were documents. There were the few who had managed to survive. One of the most famous witnesses was Dina Pronicheva. She was Jewish, an actress at the Kyiv Puppet Theatre. She managed to survive Babyn Yar, and after the war she gave testimony. Her testimony became one of those rare voices that broke through the almost impossible. A person who had seen the edge of death tried to tell the living what had happened there. Such testimonies matter, not only because they prove the crime. They return human temperature to the event. A report has a number. A testimony has breath. But then something happened to memory that cannot be explained in one word. It was not simple denial. The Soviet authorities knew about the shootings. They wrote about Nazi atrocities. They tried individual criminals. They used the theme of German crimes in post-war memory of the war. But the tragedy was recognized, and at the same time not fully named. In official language, the formula appeared more and more often: peaceful Soviet citizens. At first glance, there is no lie in it. The Jews of Kyiv really were Soviet citizens. They lived in a Soviet city. Many of their relatives fought in the Red Army. They were part of a society that endured the war. But in that formula, the main thing disappeared. They were not killed because they were simply citizens. They were killed because Nazi ideology considered Jews a people marked for destruction. When a person is killed as a Jew, and then allowed to be remembered only as a citizen, memory becomes incomplete. It seems to mourn, but it does not name the cause of death. It seems to lay flowers, but it removes the name from the grave. Why did the word Jews become so difficult for official Soviet memory? The answer does not fit into one sentence. Soviet ideology built the memory of the war around the common heroism and common suffering of the Soviet people. This had a real basis. The war truly brought enormous losses to many peoples of the Soviet Union. Soldiers of different nationalities fought, died, liberated cities, reached Berlin. Millions of civilians of different nationalities were killed, deported, died from hunger, bombing, and punitive operations. But within this common narrative, the Soviet system often did not want to single out the specific Jewish tragedy. Because to recognize it meant recognizing that Nazi extermination policy had a concrete target: Jews as a people. To recognize that meant recognizing that Jewish memory had the right to its own separate voice. And for the Soviet authorities, a separate voice of national grief often sounded suspicious, especially if that voice was Jewish. After the war, this became even more dangerous. In the late 1940s, the campaign against so-called rootless cosmopolitans intensified. Behind that phrase, state suspicion toward the Jewish intelligentsia was often hidden. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was destroyed. There were arrests. There were executions. There was an atmosphere in which the Jewish subject could look not like memory, but like risk. And here a terrible paradox appears. During the war, Soviet propaganda could speak about Nazi crimes. But when Jewish writers, journalists, and witnesses tried to compile a separate book about the mass murder of Jews in the occupied territories, that work became inconvenient. Wassily Grossman and Ilya Ehrenburg took part in creating The Black Book, a collection of testimonies about the extermination of Soviet Jews. That book was a document of pain. It contained not slogans, but human voices, places, names, the blood of families and the ashes of communities. But in the Soviet Union, it was not published when it should have been published, because it named too directly what official memory preferred to dissolve into a general image of suffering. The Jews were killed as Jews. and memory was asked to speak more quietly. We have reached the middle of this story, and if you feel how important it is to return precise words to historical memory, write in the comments what the phrase "to name the victims" means to you. Like this video and subscribe to the channel so that topics like this do not remain in the shadows. Babyn Yar became not only a place of execution, it became a test for post-war conscience. The first post-war years could have become a time for an open memorial. Names could have appeared. An inscription could have appeared that stated directly, "The Jews of Kyiv were murdered here. Families were destroyed here. Here, the Nazi machine committed one of the largest crimes of the Holocaust by bullets." But instead, for a long time, the place remained almost without a proper language of memory. Moreover, the ravine itself was repeatedly pulled into the logic of urban planning, as if land could become neutral if soil were poured over it, a road laid through it, a district built, the terrain altered. This did not always look like a loud prohibition. Sometimes forgetting arrives in the form of plans, blueprints, and construction machinery. The system did not always shout, "Be silent." Sometimes it simply did not write the necessary word. Sometimes it did not put up a monument. Sometimes it changed the wording. Sometimes it said, "There is no need to single anyone out." Sometimes it turned a place of death into a wasteland, a park, a slope, a territory where a passerby no longer understands what memory lies beneath the earth. But silence is never empty. Silence also educates. If for decades people are told only Soviet citizens, a new generation may never learn that at Babyn Yar, on September 29th and 30th, Jews were killed specifically. Not as a random part of a large statistic, but as the main target of that particular extermination action. And then it is not the fact that disappears. It is the meaning. Because the Holocaust is not simply mass killings during the war. It was an attempt to destroy the Jewish people as a people. If the word Jews is removed, the event remains terrible, but becomes incomprehensible. The viewer sees the blood, but does not see the ideology, sees the death, but does not see why the killer chose these particular people. And when the reason is not visible, memory becomes vulnerable to lies. One can say, everyone suffered equally. One can say, there is no need to divide the victims. One can say, does it really matter what nationality the murdered people were? But that is the wrong question. It matters not in order to set one group of victims against another. It matters because the killers themselves divided people. The Nazi machine came for Jews precisely as Jews. It searched for them through documents, through lists, through neighbors' denunciations, through appearance, surname, origin. It did not ask whether a person was good, whether he was a communist, whether she was religious, whether they spoke Yiddish, Russian, or Ukrainian. It placed a sentence on them in advance. And if memory refuses to name this, it involuntarily softens the logic of the criminal. Not because it wants to justify the murder, but because it is afraid to recognize its exact meaning. But in the Soviet Union, there were people who tried to speak the truth. One of the loudest voices was Yevgeny Yevtushenko. In 1961, he wrote the poem Babyn Yar. It began with a line that struck almost like a blow against official silence. There are no monuments over Babyn Yar. That line was not simply poetry. It was a public record of absence. The poet saw not only a ravine, he saw a hole in memory. The poem caused a huge response and controversy. It spoke about Jewish victims, about Soviet anti-Semitism, about the fact that the silence around Babyn Yar could not be considered normal. Yevtushenko was not Jewish, and that is precisely why his gesture was special. He tried to say that memory of Jews should not be the concern of Jews alone. It is a question of human honesty. Later, Dmitri Shostakovich used Yevtushenko's text in his 13th Symphony. Music did what sometimes a monument cannot do. It forced silence to sound. But even a loud poem did not cancel the system. In 1966, the magazine Yunost published Anatoly Kuznetsov's book Babyn Yar, a documentary novel based on his memories, observations, testimonies, and materials. Kuznetsov had been a teenager in occupied Kyiv and lived near the site of the tragedy. But the Soviet publication was censored. The full text appeared only after Kuznetsov left for the West. And again, we see the truth was not entirely absent. It broke through literature, through poetry, through music, through witnesses, through people who came to the ravine on the anniversary of the shooting, even when official memory looked at them with suspicion. Viktor Nekrasov, Ivan Juba, Jewish activists, Kyiv residents, dissidents, different people in different years tried to return Babyn Yar to its true sound. They understood. If the state does not give the name can still be spoken aloud. But the state machine was colder and lasted longer than human impulse. In 1976, a large Soviet monument finally appeared at Babyn Yar. It seemed that after 35 years, the place had received a sign of memory. But the inscription again spoke of murdered citizens of Kyiv and prisoners of war. It still made no separate mention of Jews. There it is, the central tragedy of the wording. There was a monument, there was memory, but the word was still absent. People were killed as Jews, while the stone spoke of them as if that did not matter. For the Soviet authorities, such language was convenient. It inserted Babyn Yar into the general heroic tragic picture of the war. It did not require a separate conversation about the Holocaust. It did not require a conversation about Jewish vulnerability. It did not require recognition that entire Jewish communities were being destroyed on Soviet soil, not somewhere far away, not only in Auschwitz or Treblinka, but next to Soviet cities, villages, roads, and cemeteries. Babyn Yar was too close, too concrete, too inconvenient. Because if the Jewish name of the victims were recognized, other questions would also have to be asked. What did neighbors know? Who helped save people? Who denounced them? Who remained silent out of fear? Who participated in the auxiliary police? Who, after the war, moved into the apartment of a vanished family? Who wanted to forget because remembering was too dangerous or too shameful? These questions cannot be asked crudely. They cannot be turned into accusations against peoples. In occupied Ukraine, there were criminals, the indifferent, witnesses, rescuers, and people who risked their lives for Jewish neighbors. The history of occupation is always more complex than a slogan. But complexity must not become a reason for silence. Nazi ideology carried the central project of extermination. The German occupation authorities organized and carried out the mass murder. Specific units and specific perpetrators committed the crime. Some local collaborators helped. Other people saved. Many were afraid. Many could do nothing. Many then lived beside the place where the earth held other people's families. And all of this requires not propaganda, but precise memory. The Soviet formula, peaceful Soviet citizens, was convenient also because it removed Jewish history from the very fabric of the city. If the victims are simply citizens, then there is no need to speak about pre-war Jewish Kyiv. About synagogues, schools, crafts, theaters, surnames, languages, family photographs, old cemeteries. There is no need to say that an entire part of the city's soul disappeared. But Babyn Yar is not only a place of death. It is also a map of a vanished life. When the Jews of Kyiv were killed, it was not only bodies that disappeared. Voices disappeared from stairwells. Family recipes disappeared. Melodies disappeared. Arguments around the table disappeared. Students who never became adults disappeared. Masters who never passed on their craft disappeared. Grandmothers who never told their grandchildren the family story disappeared. Future books, letters, weddings, photographs, professions disappeared. The Holocaust does not destroy only the present. It kills the future. And when memory later speaks too generally, it is as if it makes that loss faceless for a second time. That is why the word matters. The word Jews in the history of Babyn Yar is not a political detail, not an ethnic marker for the sake of statistics, not an attempt to take pain away from other victims. It is the key to understanding the crime. Without that word, Babyn Yar becomes a tragedy without an explanation. With that word, it becomes what it was. One of the central sites of the extermination of Jews on the territory of the occupied Soviet Union. A place of mass murder, a site of the Holocaust by bullets, and at the same time a place of memory for other victims of Nazi terror. Only such memory is honest. Memory that says, Jews were killed here, and others were killed here too. But on September 29th and 30th, Jews were led there precisely because they were Jews. In 1991, already against the backdrop of the collapse of the Soviet Union and Ukrainian independence, a menorah appeared at Babyn Yar, a monument to the Jewish victims. This was 50 years after the first mass shootings. 50 years is almost a human lifetime. Half a century during which the word returned slowly, through pain, through poems, through witnesses, through forbidden conversations, through anniversaries, through people who came to the place where the official inscription still did not say everything. The menorah did not erase all disputes. Babyn Yar remains a complex place of memory even today. It has many layers. The Jewish tragedy, Roma victims, Soviet prisoners of war, Ukrainian nationalists, hospital patients, victims of Nazi occupation, later disputes over memorials, urban development, politics, archives, different national memories. But the appearance of the menorah became an important act of restoring the name. Not a complete solution, but a turning point. Stone finally said what families had known from the very beginning. They were Jews. Kyiv Jews. People who had homes, professions, children, elderly relatives, suitcases, documents, money, worn clothing, hope, fear, and a name. What should be remembered from this story? Not only the number, though the number is terrible. 33,771 Jews were killed at Babyn Yar in 2 days. The date should be remembered. The 29th and 30th of September, 1941. The place should be remembered. Kyiv, the ravine of Babyn Yar, which became one of the most terrible symbols of the Holocaust by bullets. The mechanism should be remembered. The Nazi occupation machine killed Jews as Jews, while Soviet post-war memory often blurred this Jewish identity with the formula Soviet citizens. And the main thing should be remembered. To name the victim is not to divide memory. It is to restore dignity to it. There is a special cruelty in first taking a person's life and then taking away their right to be mourned as who they were. Babyn Yar teaches exactly this. The killers wanted to destroy people. Silence tried to dissolve their name, but memory resisted. It resisted in the testimony of Dina Pronicheva, in the work of Grossman and Ehrenberg, in Yevtushenko's lines, in Shostakovich's music, in Kuznetsov's book, in the people who came to the ravine when it was inconvenient, in the families who told their children, Those buried there are not simply citizens. The Jews of Kyiv are buried there. And today, when the word Jews is spoken beside Babyn Yar, it is not a cry for revenge. It is not a political slogan. It is the return of precision, the return of a name, the return of a human face to the place where an official formula stood for too long. At the beginning of this story, there was an absent word. At the end, it must be spoken calmly, directly, and with dignity. At Babyn Yar, Jews were killed. Twos. They must not be hidden again behind a convenient general phrase. All victims of this place must be remembered. But to remember honestly means not erasing whom exactly the Nazi machine came to destroy in those September days. To kill a person is to take away their life. But to erase the victim's name from memory is to try to take away their final right, to be mourned as who they were. If you watched until the end, write the code word in the comments. Silence. Let that word be not a sign of forgetting, but a reminder that silence can be broken. And when a forgotten Jewish name is spoken again, the silence retreats.